Hello and welcome everyone to the Future Ready Scholar Conference. My name is Marina and I'm excited to have you all here today. We'll be looking at the PhD plan, so a really useful and applied strategy for approaching and succeeding in the PhD more effectively. And hopefully, of course, some lessons in there that are applicable across the board, like no matter if you're doing a PhD, you're doing a postdoc, or you're working on research in some context, we can still take away some lessons from kind of big picture planning and collaborative ideas.
Doing a PhD requires passion, perseverance, and resilience. It also requires a lot of coffee, tolerance for rejection, and an ability to communicate your research in vastly different ways. And for this reason, I believe that a PhD is an incredibly powerful achievement. You dedicate 3 to 8 years of your life to a research project that you're passionate about. And it's potentially the most formative piece of your academic career because for most of us, this is the one time in our careers when we're able to prioritize research above all else. But you might be surprised to know that the reality of a PhD is far from idealistic. There's the publish or perish culture, the pressure to present your research, to gain teaching experience, to mark papers. It means that stress levels are high and there's a financial strain, which does have a real impact for many of us. Then there's also the peer review process, predatory journals, imposter syndrome, and procrastination. But on top of all that, there's constant rejection, there's rejected papers, there's ignored funding applications, getting sidelined at conferences, and your parents are very unlikely to know what your PhD is about. But everyone seems to want to know when you're going to submit it. So because of the very nature of studying a niche research interest, PhDs are often completed in isolation. Loneliness, therefore, is a common experience, whether you're working from home, in an office, in a lab, or as a distance learner. We very rarely enter this journey with an academic network already behind us. And all of this is why I started the PhD Place in 2022. So it began as a Twitter account back when it was called Twitter, at a time when I was very isolated in my own PhD journey. And I started by sharing my experiences of doing a PhD. And this very quickly turned into a blog and a YouTube account for people to share their experiences too. So today we've shared stories from scholars at over 100 universities. I think it's more than that now, but it was 100 a couple of months ago, and have just under 150,000 followers across our networks. We've launched a series of free writing groups, we've held cash giveaways, and we've branched out into video walkthroughs of different research tools, contributing to this significant commentary on the rise of AI. So today's talk is going to be an opportunity to reflect and hopefully learn together. If you feel comfortable, I encourage you to embrace the idea that collaboration is so much more powerful than competition. So please share your stories and your advice with your new international community of researchers here in the comments of this conference. And if I've learned anything from my role in the PhD Place, it's that yes, the PhD experience and the academic career can very often feel isolating, but we can learn from each other by being open with one another and benefiting from pooling our advice and our understanding like we are today. So Today, I'll be presenting the PhD plan, which pulls the wisdom, the knowledge, and the advice that I've learned from the PhD community over the last few years. By following this plan and implementing small changes to your research journey, you can hopefully make meaningful progress towards your PhD whilst also looking after yourself in the process. So, prioritize is the first step in the PhD plan. To actually make the most of that time, you need a clear plan. Otherwise, you risk going in hundreds of different directions and making absolutely no progress. So the most important thing I want you to prioritize in your academic work is consistency. And actually, I want you to prioritize consistency over perfection, which is not an easy thing to do. Progress doesn't come from waiting for the perfect moment to write your thesis or read that paper. You don't need to wait for a Monday or the first day of the month or a sudden burst of inspiration or motivation. In fact, it is never too early in your PhD to develop an effective and regular writing habit. Progress comes from showing up again and again and again. And you don't need to have those perfect words in your mind in order to type them out on your computer or write them down. And of course, you already know this. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you just to be consistent because that would be absolutely useless. But what I am going to do is talk about why it's so hard to stay consistent and what small practical changes can actually help you build a habit of consistency in a way that's realistic and sustainable. So firstly, ask yourself, are your goals clear enough? One of the biggest obstacles to consistency, at least in my experience, is vagueness. So maybe you sit down at your desk each morning and you think, I need to write a thesis. Or maybe you've honed it in a little bit, I need to write my literature review. But both of these are just too broad, which means that you don't actually know where to start. One of the most demotivating things is getting to the end of the day and thinking, what did I actually accomplish? So instead, try being specific. That big picture, your thesis, your literature review is important. But to get there, you need to take small, actionable steps. So before you start, maybe even the night before, try defining what success looks like for each day. So instead of, I need to work on my thesis, you could say, I'm going to write 500 words today. I will finish editing this chapter by Friday, or maybe you'll use Litmaps, create a literature map from 10 a.m. to midday. And the clearer those goals are, the more likely you are to actually achieve them and achieve them without feeling completely overwhelmed. Next, you have to ask yourself, are your goals realistic? Academics juggle a ridiculous number of responsibilities. We've got planning experiments, recruiting participants, reviewing literature, teaching, marking, writing papers. That's before you even start to think about your thesis chapters, and it's a lot. When you've got that much to do, it can be so overwhelming that you actually end up doing nothing at all. And then, of course, that makes you feel even worse. So how can you make sure that you keep showing up? Firstly, by making that to-do list realistic. So I recently came across a really fantastic tip from Dr. Vicky Wright, who is the PhD life coach. If you haven't checked her out, go and do it. She's awesome. But she suggested that at the start of each week, cut your to-do list in half. And okay, that might sound a little bit drastic, but I love this tip because most of us actually overestimate what we can get done in a single week. And at the same time, underestimate what we can achieve over time if we just show up consistently. Next, I want to talk about building good habits and protecting your research time. So, are you actually protecting those goals? Prioritization isn't just about setting goals, it's about protecting them and ensuring that they get completed. So maybe your biggest challenge isn't actually time management. Maybe your biggest challenge is just sitting down and actually getting started, which I can absolutely relate to. If that is the case, then I would recommend habit stacking, which is basically a fancy way of saying you can attach your PhD work to something that you already do. So, for example, after I finish the dishes, I will write for 30 minutes. Or after I have coffee, I will read one journal article. So by pairing your PhD work with something that's already a habit, consistency becomes something that's far more natural. Now I want to talk about not just starting to work, but actually starting a project and getting over the challenge of a blank page. So there's two approaches that I have used in the past. Firstly, which is a really great mindset shift, is free writing. Free writing is a practice where you maybe choose to set a timer. So you might say half an hour, 15 minutes, whatever it is. But importantly, you forget about academic writing conventions, about grammar, about spelling, and you just simply write and get everything there, everything down on the paper. And it doesn't matter if you don't make, if it doesn't make sense or, and actually, I would encourage you not to read it until you've written, until you've got everything, every single possible idea that you have in your brain down on the paper. And then later you can revisit it, reformulate your thoughts, and edit what you've written. If you prefer a more visual approach, you can also try doing a similar practice, but by drawing your research. So I once attended a workshop at the University of Warwick, where a researcher encouraged us to take a piece of paper and some colored pens and to draw our research very literally. And it was actually very useful because it forced us to think about our research topics in new ways and made that process feel much less rigid. And I absolutely cannot draw. So just know that that does not matter in the slightest. Okay, next, I would like to welcome Jamie. I will hand you over to my colleague for today and guest speaker, who is also deeply committed to supporting PhD students. So Dr. Jamie Pei will guide us through a reflection of our practices by posing really important questions about our research and connecting them to our research goals. So I'll hand you over to Jamie now.
Hello, 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 everyone. So good to be here today, and an honor to be co-presenting with Nathan today. So just a quick intro to who I am. I'm Jamie Pei. I myself did my PhD in qualitative social science at the University of York in the UK and completed my PhD in 2021 and have been conducting trainings, workshops, and coaching for PhD folk since around that time. I was already doing training while I was still doing my PhD. I now also work with self-employed people, solo business owners. I also run a coaching business. I call myself a work play coach, and this will become evident in what I'm about to share with you. I'm very passionate about helping people to find truly genuine harmony and integration between their work and their life. I don't like to use the term work-life balance. I think it's more than balance. I think it's about integration and harmony. Um, and this is an approach that I bring into my PhD coaching and training work as well. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, how I got into training and coaching was that I very much loved my own PhD experience. I found it one of the most rewarding, joyful, pleasurable, enriching experiences of my life. And I recognize now, thinking back, that one of the key factors in that was because I was very, very deliberate and intentional about not letting the PhD take over and consume my life. I was very, very clear about the fact that I wanted my PhD to live alongside and be a truly integrated part of my whole life, not to take over everything. Okay. And we see this happening quite a lot in academia, right? Like the research and the PhD becomes all consuming. So this is what I'm going to be talking about with you. As we're going through Nate's great plan and thinking about how you design your PhD experience, this section is going to be about how to design your best life, both within the PhD and beyond it. How you can really design your days and get very, very clear about shaping and curating your PhD experience so that it becomes really lovingly integrated into a part of your life. So what my section here aims to do is to help you to really get clarity around your goals, both professionally, academically, and personally. It's going to help you tap into and reconnect with your innermost motivations and core values, and to rekindle what is important to you, what you're passionate about, what you stand for, both in your research life and in your work, as well as in the rest of your life. And then we're going to look at how we can use all of these elements. I'll show you a little dynamic map that we can use to then help you to make better aligned decisions for both your research and your life. So we're going to look at what is joyful and important for you in 3 key areas. In the research itself, that's the first one. In the wider PhD experience. And finally, in your life as a whole. Okay, and then we're going to bring all of those elements together into a dynamic map, which will serve as a kind of a tool and a guide for you to plan your next steps, whether that's making decisions for within your PhD and your research, or for future career planning, or even broaden that for your future life planning. Okay, so we're going to start with just 1 or 2 minutes of reflection. I can't see you, obviously, with how this is set up at the moment. So I am going to run through some prompts and some questions. Feel free to take a screenshot of the slides. I do encourage you to take these away and spend some quiet time, fix yourself a nice drink and a snack, sit down somewhere comfy and work through these prompts in more detail on your own. There's only so much that we're going to be able to do in this short section, but just take a note of these prompts and go away and spend some time really reflecting, really get in touch with like that core part of you that sets you alight, that feels sparky and aligned and juicy for you, right? And journal and reflect and make a note of these. So let's go right back. We're going to start by looking at the research itself. We're going to go right back to the very, very early basics of the research that you're doing and reconnecting and remembering what has felt joyful about it so far. If you're at the beginning of your PhD, that's still fine. There is something along the journey that has brought you to this point to start a PhD. So what is it? What is that? What was that first fire that inspired you to pursue a PhD or to do further research in this particular area? Now, just a moment to acknowledge here that, it's very easy to get very cynical, to start feeling overwhelmed about everything that you have to do, and to also kind of feel like, oh, well, this is work, what is there to be joyful about in this? So this is about really countering that, okay? It's getting back to the beginning, that's first spark that inspired you to pursue this research, to think about what brought you to the subject in the first place. Why was it so important for you to have made that decision to commit this number of years to doing this deep work? So here are the first set of questions for you to reflect and journal around. What do you love and enjoy about your research? Why is this research important to you? What brought you to this subject or to this field in the first place? Why does it interest you? Maybe it's nothing deep. Maybe you just really love Victorian trains, or you just really love studying the twisted politics of 18th century wherever, right? And finally, this is one of my favorite questions. How can your research change the world? And I know this sounds very dramatic and that's deliberate. It's meant to be a big question because honestly, truly, whatever your research is in, there is something in it that can change the world. And that change might only be a small change. It might only be for a small part of the world, but it is still change. So I'm just going to keep quiet now for about a minute for you to think these through, maybe start jotting down a few notes for yourself around these questions.
Dr. Pei, could I just ask you, someone is asking in the chat if we can repeat the questions because they don't, we have, or maybe is there one question on the slide here that they can think about for this time just because they can't remember all these really good questions you're bringing up?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yes, let's answer that big question. How can your research change the world? And
Cool.
can I just check, can you see the slides? Because the questions are on the slides at the moment.
Yeah, one, two, three, four. These five questions, right? These are the ones we
Yeah.
focused on. Yes. Okay, great. Then yes, then the audience. Yeah. I mean, I can see those. Yeah, everyone can see them. That's great. So these are
Yeah.
the
So
ones we
feel
can
free
focus
to
on.
screen grab take a screenshot and you can go back to visit all the other questions later. But for now, I'd start by answering, how can your research change the world? I'm just going to give you another like 15 seconds, just in the interest of time. And you don't have to have a perfect answer. This is definitely something that you can come back to. And in fact, I do encourage you to regularly check back in with these questions across the life of your PhD to really reconnect with those initial motivations. Okay, Nath, can you please move to the next slide? All right, so next, we're going to widen our scope a little bit to look a little more broadly at the larger, wider PhD experience and the PhD journey. So this is less about the actual research itself or the subject or discipline that you're in, and it's more about your experience as a whole. So not just the research, but all the other supporting activities, your interactions, the events that go alongside the research of the main, thesis. And also the skills and the talents and the capabilities that you are discovering in the process of participating in and enjoying these other experiences and activities. So it's very, very common for us to just sit around and moan and have a little rant with each other. I'm absolutely guilty of doing this myself. We just sit around and talk about everything that's going wrong in our research, and we hate the system. We're mad at our supervisors. We don't like this one person in our department who's giving us a lot of bother. So this exercise is to flip the script a little bit and to refocus our attention on what is going well. What are you doing well? What are you enjoying about the PhD journey? So here are some more questions for you to reflect on. What activity outside of research have you participated in that you've enjoyed? So things like conferences, maybe, event organization, networking, teaching, publishing. What parts of the PhD journey are you enjoying so far and why? And what skills have you discovered or developed so far during your PhD? So again, I'm just going to give you a real quick minute to think about these questions. All right. Can we move to the next section, please? Next slide. Okay, so now we're zooming out even further to look at your core life values. So this is about what's important to you in your life as a whole, and what are the values that you want to shape everything that you do in your life, not just within the PhD, but across the spectrum of your life. So, we get very bogged down. It's very easy to speed along trying to finish all your deadlines, get your tasks done, get your experiments done, collect data. And you get caught up in all of that sometimes you can lose that inner compass of like, where are you actually going? What do you actually want for your life? So thinking about your core values, this is going to shape how you experience your PhD journey, and it's also going to shape how you think about and approach both life and careers beyond the PhD. All right. So this is going to sound a little bit corny, maybe even a little bit cliched, but really these are your North Stars, right? This is your North Star, your core values. This is what is going to anchor you back to help you make the decisions that you need to make. So can we go to the next slide, please? I'm very conscious of time. The next one with the core values. Yes, there we go. All right. Please take a screen grab of this. These are just some of the values that you may want in your life and that are important to you and to your day-to-day, like moment-to-moment happiness. So I would like, again, to encourage you, make yourself a nice drink, sit somewhere quiet, and think about which 3 values out of this list would be your top 3. And this may take a little time to figure out, but once you figure out those top 3 values, those values are going to be your North Star. They're going to be the anchor and the foundation that you always return to inform the decisions that you're trying to make, to inform your next steps, to consider how you want to proceed. When you're at a fork in the road, that's really what's going to help you to decide which direction to go. All right, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah. Okay, so finally, we're going to put it all together, all right? Use this Venn diagram to look at all your reflections in terms of what's joyful and important to you in your research, what's joyful and important to you in your overall PhD experience, and what is important for you in your life as a whole. And then start noticing where those overlaps in those values might be, and use those values as a guide for making onward decisions. So just a very, very quick example before I wrap this up. You may want to look at if you're trying to decide on kind of what activity to participate in, okay? So that's really about your research and your research journey. So you might want to ask yourself, if you're deciding whether or not to take on an activity, you might ask yourself, okay, well, does this activity align with what is joyful and important for me, both in the research and in the research journey? Okay. As you're planning your future career, as you're thinking about what you want to do after the PhD, you might then look at the overlap between the 2 circles between the PhD experience and the joyful life, to think about, okay, what kind of skills and activities have I participated in that would also align with the kind of life and things that I would want to do beyond the PhD. So ultimately, you want to get to the sweet spot in between all 3 of the circles where your values are aligned across all 3 of your spheres. What's joyful in your research lines up with what's joyful in your research life, and that lines up with what's joyful and important to you across your wider life and values. All right, I am over time and I can't dive into this more deeply, but if you want to come and speak to me and Nath, we're happy to dive into this with you a little bit deeper at another time. But hopefully that's going to be a nice start for you to start thinking about what is really truly important for you and what you would like to direct both your PhD experience and the experience beyond that. All right, I'm handing back to Nathan now. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much to you, Jamie, for that reflection and reminder of what truly matters during your research journey. I struggled with that list of words. I think I will have to go back and look through those. I remember when I was about halfway through my master's, I started looking through the internet for PhD opportunities. I remember finding my potential supervisors and reading the titles of their research papers in just absolute amazement. To me, they were the most fantastic, interesting people. Their research was fascinating, it was relevant to my interests, but they'd also already found out so much about my research topic that I was so passionate about. Um, okay, the application was hard work, but I really remember that feeling of excitement. There was a lot of waiting involved, but that anticipation, the recognition of the opportunity, and the chance that I was being given to do a PhD, and the joy of being accepted onto the program, that's one of the things that definitely continues to fuel me and fuel my passion for academia. But this leads perfectly onto what I want to talk about next, which is the L in the PhD plan framework, and that is leveraging your network and community. So I first met Jamie a couple of years ago after she ran a workshop called Perfectly Imperfect Writing Practices for Your Thesis. Hopefully that is right. I think that is right. What stuck with me on that day, besides the fact that she's obviously a very brilliant speaker, was that it taught me something I really needed to hear early on in my PhD, and that is that it's okay for things to be quite messy. And instead of trying to chase perfection, we should all try and be just that little bit kinder to ourselves, pay attention to what our brains and our bodies need, and accept things aren't always going to go to plan. And I still remember that when I feel stuck, just to take a step back, go for a walk, try and find a way to get myself back on track. So, this part of this part of the talk stems from an unfortunate but very real truth about academia that more often than not, it's not about what you know, but who you know. And does that mean that your research and your knowledge, it doesn't matter? Of course not, but it does highlight the importance of building those professional net relationships, those networks at your university, at other institutions too, and also intersectionally. There are, of course, plenty of very classic ways to build your network. So that often starts with the immediate academic circles, so the people around you at your university. Um, this includes managing your expectations of your supervisor and also their expectations of you. Networking with colleagues in your department and adjacent fields, fellow PhD researchers, and postdocs. And of course, these spaces are typical networking grounds, but they can also present challenges. So, for instance, in a social sciences department, it's quite likely that most of your colleagues won't have the same research interests as you do, but honestly, I don't think it matters too much from a networking perspective. I'd actually encourage you to engage with talks and conferences that are not directly related to your research. If you think about conferences, conference themes are always quite broad, but they can still be very valuable because stepping outside of your niche gives you the chance to learn about different subjects, different methods, and different perspectives. But it also helps you to build friendships and a sense of academic community. At, at the end of the day, we're all in that same boat, doing a PhD or navigating academia, regardless of our specific research topics. Also, let's be honest, showing up for others matters. So if you attend your colleagues' research talks, chances are they're going to be in the audience when it's your turn to present. That's just how collegiality works. If you support others, then hopefully that support will come back to you when you need it. So I just want to expand slightly on conferences. Presenting your own research is a really fantastic way to develop your network, but I want you to think that the benefits of that might not even be in the room. So if I give you an example, recently I had the amazing opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity, to present my research findings at Stanford's Department of Religious Studies. And after the talk, a scholar came up to me and they said, "Hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. This is not my field, but do you know Professor X at University Y?" Wasn't Charles Xavier, though that would have been pretty cool. But they said, if you want to give me your email, then I can make the connection for you. And really, that is the power of networking. You don't know who will pass your name along to the right person. And even if your research doesn't directly connect with someone in that room, that person might know exactly who you should be speaking to. But of course, these networks, they can often feel quite transactional, and that's where the distinction between a network and a community is really important. One of the ideas that stuck with me throughout my PhD journey came from a professor who made this distinction between developing a network versus finding your community. And this was a tenured professor emphasizing the isolation that people can feel even further down the line. Yes, it is very, very, very important to get your name out there, to promote yourself in academic circles, and to be known for your work, to make connections at conferences, to share your research on social media. But it's just as important, if not more important, to find those people that will genuinely support you, to just find your team. And that shift in mindset completely changed how I personally approach networking. It meant that the connections I was building weren't just professional, they were also meaningful and sustainable too. And most importantly, it made me feel less alone when, what can be a very tricky and unpredictable journey. If you can, try to engage not just with the conference itself, but with everything that happens around it. So, for instance, here today, engage with the chat if you can. Some of the most valuable conversations that I've ever had didn't happen during the conference session. They actually happened during the coffee breaks or in the bar afterwards. Yeah, so just take advantage of those extra spaces. Now, I get it. It's not always possible to speak to someone at an event. Hopefully, your supervisor will be there with you to introduce you to their network, but not everybody does have that luxury. And it can also be quite intimidating to just walk up to someone and introduce yourself, especially if they're like a keynote speaker or someone really important, maybe a celebrity professor. Sometimes you have to be more strategic, and that is completely fine. You can follow up after the event, you can send cold emails, be persistent, but in like an enthusiastic way, not an unsettling way. And if you meet someone at a conference or connect with them online, then send them a quick message or just to keep that conversation going. I've connected with so many scholars just by reaching out after reading their paper and trying to find out more. And for me, taking those few minutes to send an email has opened doors to institutional visits overseas. I spent 6 months of my PhD in the Netherlands working as a research assistant. That all started with an email. It's led to co-authoring papers with leading scholars in my field, online meetings with scholars in other countries who are doing very similar studies to mine, which was really interesting. And also people just sending me their papers, which is always a good thing. And of course, don't be afraid to really get creative with how you build your network. So take it from a student who is currently very privileged to be giving a 1 hour talk with Litmaps. Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones that you create yourself. But it's really important to surround yourself with good people, people who lift you up, because you shouldn't have to do your PhD alone. This brings me to the third part of the PhD plan, which is about the importance of being adaptable, being able to adapt. Now, the best piece of advice I ever received from my PhD supervisor was to be teachable. At that time, ironically, I was like, yeah, obviously that makes sense. But over time, I really came to understand and appreciate what that meant to be teachable, to learn from others, and to adapt your approach to your research. And that advice was for my end of year meeting with my supervisors. And let's be honest, your PhD research very rarely goes exactly as planned. It could be something like an experiment that failed, a participant that cancelled an interview, data that didn't support your argument, or maybe finding a thesis with the exact research question as yours from 1982. It has happened, I've seen it. Or maybe just a rejection email that makes you question your entire academic career. All of that is perfectly valid to feel. And in fact, it's completely normal. It happens to all of us. But your research is supposed to evolve, especially from that first day. But the most important part of your PhD is not your PhD, it's you, and you are supposed to evolve, to learn, and to adapt as well as you go along. But adaptability is just not something that I can share with you. It's something that you develop by being open to outside influences. What I can do is share the advice and strategies that have helped me during my PhD journey in the hope that some of them might be useful to you. But the reality is that we all have different PhDs and we all navigate those research challenges slightly differently. So this is an excellent opportunity for us to pool our resources here and embody that ethos of collaboration. So whether it's a specific strategy, a piece of advice, or even just a small habit that has changed the way you approach your research, I want you to think about and share one thing that has helped you during your PhD in the comments below this talk. Hopefully, we can flood the comments with new ways to embrace the unpredictable nature of research and learn from each other's tips. And hopefully, Marina can share some of the best ones with us at the end of this talk too. These are some of the best pieces of advice I've received that have ultimately transformed my approach to my work. But what's striking about them is that they're not particularly enormous. They are generally quite small. So if I go through them and you can choose to take them on board, or perhaps it will inspire you to share something that you've been using. So number one is I always keep a progress book. At the end of each work session, at the end of each day, I write one sentence summary of what I've accomplished and what needs to happen tomorrow. And it's particularly the part that needs to happen tomorrow that helps me maintain continuity and reduces the stress of figuring out where to start the next day. On that note, if I walk away from my computer, I use a placeholder word while writing. So when switching between sections in a document, I always use a random word in my case, I like to use fruit like apple or banana. So it's a word that you can easily search for in the document and pick up where you left off. So just use Control F, apple, and then you'll find where you were as you're switching between different parts of your work. If your PhD happens to be on fruit, then maybe use something else, maybe use sports. But yeah, that's a tip that has helped me. Tip number 3 is to walk away from your work that is finished, the first draft, that needs editing. After you've finished a draft, defamiliarize yourself from your work before you start editing it. Otherwise, you're not going to spot your mistakes. There's a couple of excellent strategies to do this, the best being time. If you can leave your work for maybe a week or two and then return to it, you'll be coming back to it with fresh eyes. That's really important. But I completely appreciate that we don't all have the luxury of time. So some other things that you could do, you could change the font. You could change the size or which font you're using. And you could also try reading your work out loud in order to engage with it in a different way. Tip number 4 is for people who work from home. And if you do quite often work from home, as many of us do, try to create some sort of separation between home and work. One way that you could do this is by taking a short walk before you start working, as if you were commuting to an office, to your PhD office. And when you come back, that's not your home anymore. Now it is your office, and you've made that journey. The last one is probably the most important for me personally because of how I navigated my PhD in the early days. Instead of checking emails throughout the day, I limit myself to 2 focused email sessions, but whatever works for you. So for example, 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon, so that you can protect your deep work time. What you're really doing here is saying no and prioritizing your time, which is definitely a skill that is needed as an academic. Some of these might sound like really small changes, but the truth is you don't need an enormous shift to make a meaningful difference to your productivity. And also, just remember that doing a PhD doesn't mean getting things right the first time. And honestly, it's very unlikely that it's going to go right the first time. As I learned from Jamie, research is messy. Try to adapt as you go. Consider trying out different tips and tricks that people have shared with us in the comments, hopefully below this talk as well. Okay, now I'd like to talk about protecting your well-being. The final part of the PhD plan is arguably the most important. You can prioritize your research by setting clear goals, leverage your networks to find communities and build opportunities and find networks. And you can also adapt to the many twists and turns of PhD life, but really none of that matters if you don't take care of yourself. Your research, your network, your ability to adapt all depend on one thing, and that is you. As I said right at the beginning of this talk, doing a PhD is challenging for each of us in lots of different ways. So, in fact, a study at the University of Westminster recently outlined that nearly half of PhD students feel that developing a mental health problem is just a normal part of the PhD journey. And okay, you are not a failure if you resonate with that statistic, but it should horrify us. It horrifies me. It's a sign that our approach, our collective approach, is actually deeply flawed, and that academia is demanding way too much of PhD students, offering way too little support, and that we need to prioritize ourselves in that process. Some days it really doesn't matter how many hours you put in. There's always that little voice in your head saying, didn't finish what I was supposed to finish today. Or maybe I should just keep working and get more words down on the page. But one of the most powerful ways to protect your well-being is to build accountability into your research. So if you had a target for that day, or you've worked a certain number of hours, stop. You need to find and nurture those sustainable habits that work best for you and your PhD. So whether it's setting realistic goals at the beginning of the day, using a logbook to track your progress, pick up where you left off, changing your workspace, moving to a new environment to reset your focus, setting boundaries with emails, or just saying no to things that simply aren't going to benefit you, logging off at 5 p.m. at the end of the day, even if you haven't completed all your tasks, there are lots of things that you can do to reset. And this final point here is really, really important. Overwork gets you absolutely nowhere but burnout. So try to build rest into your routine before rest becomes an absolute necessity. Okay. In a recent blog post on the PhD Place, Professor Inga Mewburn, who is better known as the Thesis Whisperer, highlighted something really important, and that is the power of creating spaces where PhD students and academics feel less alone. So she writes about how academia can be incredibly isolating and how platforms like her blog provide not only practical advice, but emotional validation and a sense of well-being. And this really resonates with me because PhD success is not just about intelligence or hard work, it's about sustainable practices, and more importantly, having a strong community and a network. And if you want to improve the PhD experience and the academic experience together, then we need to create more spaces for connection. So if I was to give you an example that's very close to my heart, I run the PhD Place online writing group. Even just writing with people at the same time as you can make an enormous difference to your accountability. We hold structured writing sessions that you're very welcome to join us. They're launching again soon. The link will be up after this talk. And the link will be on our website, that's thePhDplace.com. And we're also on most social networks at the PhD Place too. But this is just one example of a space that you might use. So if the time and date for our writing sessions don't work for you, then there are other writing groups online, and there are other free writing groups online as well that I would encourage you to use. But I want you to take away from this that there are communities of researchers out there who are here to continue the conversation with you beyond these types of talks, who are actually getting it and who are here for you. And to end, I just want to remind you that it doesn't matter what stage you are in your academic career, it doesn't matter if you're doing a master's, if you're in a first year, or you're a tenured professor, you have already achieved so much by getting to this point, and that is already worth celebrating. So please remember, if you are doing a PhD as well, your PhD doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be finished. And as always, to everyone who's joined us today, good luck on your academic journey, and thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. That was just fantastic. And of course, a big thank you as well to your colleague Jamie. What a wonderful and comprehensive deep dive into the entire PhD process, but zooming out to like the life-sized version. Thanks so much for this.